How the Titanic cost more than anyone expected, then kept costing more for over a century. $7.5 million. That's what it took to launch the RMS Titanic into the waters off Belfast in 1912, somewhere between 200 and 225 million in today's currency. The ship was insured for roughly half that figure. It sank on its maiden voyage, pulling more than 1,500 of the 2,224 souls aboard into the freezing depths of the North Atlantic. What followed, in dollars, in courtrooms, and in a reckoning that refuses to fully close, is a story that has been accumulating interest for over 100 years. But before the ledgers, you need to understand the decisions. The financial wreckage only makes sense once you grasp the human choices that preceded it. The Titanic was constructed by Harland and Wolff in Belfast on behalf of the White Star Line, and at the moment of her launch, she was the largest moving object ever assembled by human hands. She met an iceberg just before midnight on April 14, 1912, and was gone in under 3 hours. More than 1,500 of the roughly 2,224 passengers and crew died in those black, frigid waters. That death toll is the reason any of this matters. Everything that comes after, every lawsuit, every insurance claim, every congressional inquiry, is an attempt to reckon with what happened on a single ship, on a single night, and why the consequences refuse to stay buried with her. Start with the construction cost, because the number tends to surprise people. For a ship of this magnitude, this mythology, you might expect something staggering. What you get instead is 1.5 million British pounds, or about $7.5 million at 1912 exchange rates. Adjusted for inflation, that lands somewhere in the $200 to $225 million range today. Here's a number that puts it in useful perspective. A single Boeing 787 Dreamliner carries a list price that falls almost exactly within that same window. The Titanic, in other words, cost roughly what a modern wide-body passenger aircraft costs, a vessel built not to cross the sky but the ocean, and one whose price tag, in hindsight, turned out to be only the opening entry on a much longer bill. Here's the detail that turned the eventual insurance claim into something truly consequential. White Star Line had insured the Titanic for just £1 million, around $5 million, against a ship that had cost an estimated £1.5 million to build. They were covering barely 2/3 of what it had taken to construct her, and even that coverage was carved up among more than 70 different underwriters at Lloyd's of London, each absorbing their own slice of the risk, anywhere from as little as £200 on the low end to £75,000 at the top. The premium they paid for all of this was strikingly modest, roughly 15 shillings per £100 insured, something close to 0.75%, a rate that said everything about how completely everyone involved had dismissed the possibility that this ship might actually go down. When it did, Lloyd's settled the full £1 million claim in roughly 30 days. That speed, more than anything else, is what cemented the disaster as one of the foundational case studies in insurance history. Evidence that even a catastrophic front-page loss could be swallowed by a market diversified enough that no single underwriter had to bear the weight alone. Now the tickets deserve a closer look, because the numbers tell their own uncomfortable story about who was expected to make it and who wasn't. The most expensive berth on the ship, a first-class parlor suite, ran to £870 for the crossing, a figure that represented roughly 9 years of annual wages for an average skilled worker in Britain in 1912. At the other end of the ship, a third-class ticket cost around £7. Still real money, about 7% of what that same skilled worker earned in a year, but within range for the emigrants who filled the overwhelming majority of those lower berths, most of them headed to America chasing something better on the far side of the Atlantic. The distance between those two prices mapped almost perfectly onto the distance in survival rates. First-class passengers lived at dramatically higher rates than those in third class, a gap that historians and statisticians have been picking apart for more than a century. And the explanation had less to do with the cost of the ticket itself than with what that cost determined, where on the ship you were placed, and how far you had to travel to reach a lifeboat. What brought everything to a head, the single most devastating combination of design shortcoming and regulatory negligence, was the lifeboat situation. Aboard the Titanic sat 20 lifeboats in all, 14 standard wooden ones, 2 smaller emergency cutters, and 4 collapsible vessels, together certified to hold 1,178 souls. The number of people actually on that ship was roughly 2,224 passengers and crew combined. The math needed no commentary. Even under the most optimistic scenario, every lifeboat filled to its last legal inch and launched without incident, just barely more than half the people on board stood any chance of survival. What actually unfolded was worse. In the pandemonium and disorientation of the evacuation, a number of boats slipped away from the ship, embarrassingly underfilled. The final tally of survivors, 705 people, didn't even reach that already grim theoretical ceiling. And here is the detail that has a way of making your jaw tighten when you sit with it long enough. None of this was illegal. The British Board of Trade, which governed such things at the time, calculated the required lifeboat capacity not by counting the human beings a vessel was carrying, but by measuring the ship's gross tonnage. Worse still, the tonnage tables those requirements were built on hadn't been meaningfully revised since 1894, an era when the grandest ocean liner afloat was a shadow of what the Titanic would become. In the 18 years between that last update and the night the ship went down, vessel sizes had roughly quadrupled. The rulebook hadn't budged a line. The Titanic, by the standards of the day, actually surpassed what the law demanded. It carried more lifeboat capacity than regulations technically required, and still couldn't account for even half the lives depending on it. It was, by every official measure, a fully compliant ship. A perfectly lawful catastrophe, already written, just waiting for the iceberg. The story of who actually made it into those lifeboats is an economic narrative unto itself, and it aligns with uncomfortable precision to what each passenger had paid for their ticket. First-class travelers survived at a rate of roughly 62%. Those in second class made it out at around 41%. Third-class passengers, the ones who had paid approximately 1/100th of what the most expensive first-class suite commanded, survived at a rate of just 25%. Where you slept on that ship accounts for a significant portion of that disparity. Third-class cabins were buried deep in the lower decks, the farthest possible point from the lifeboats mounted on the upper deck, and survivor testimony, along with subsequent formal inquiries, described gates and barriers, originally installed to meet the immigration inspection standards common to ocean liners of that period, that slowed or outright stopped third-class passengers trying to reach the boat deck as the ship went down. Of the 109 children on board, only a single first-class child perished. Every child traveling in second class survived. In third class, 52 children died. More young lives lost in that one ticket category than in first and second class put together. The Titanic went down in class order almost as neatly as it went down bow first, and that pattern has occupied statisticians and historians for over a century since. Not because a more expensive ticket literally purchased a seat in a lifeboat, but because it purchased a cabin placement, a deck assignment, and a closeness to the boats that money, in the most direct and devastating sense imaginable, was able to buy. There is also the question of the ship that could have intervened and chose not to. The SS Californian was somewhere between 10 and 20 miles away that night, near enough that her crew reportedly observed distress rockets being fired from the Titanic, yet her radio operator had powered down his wireless equipment for the evening and retired to bed approximately 10 minutes before the Titanic transmitted her first distress signal. Formal investigations conducted independently by the United States Senate and the British Board of Trade in the weeks following the disaster devoted substantial time and public money to examining precisely what the Californian's crew had witnessed, at what hour they had witnessed it, and why nothing had been done about it, without ever arriving at a conclusion that satisfied everyone involved. Both inquiries fed directly into the argument for mandatory round-the-clock radio monitoring, which would later be enshrined in the SOLAS Convention, an expensive and still ongoing operational requirement for every passenger vessel built since, justified entirely by the story of one ship a handful of miles distant that never received the cry for help until it was already too late. What followed the sinking, financially and legally, didn't just shake one company or one ocean liner. It remade an entire industry, and in doing so, changed how the modern world approaches the very concept of safety regulation. In November 1913, delegates from the world's leading maritime nations gathered in London and spent the following months hammering out the first international convention for the safety of life at sea. That document, now known simply as SOLAS, remains the foundational treaty governing maritime safety more than a century after it was written. It has outlasted the ships, the companies, and the governments that created it. SOLAS did something that no rule before it had done. It required, for the first time, that every ship carry lifeboat capacity for every single person on board. Not a tonnage-based approximation. Not a formula that looked reasonable on paper but fell apart in practice. Every person. This closed the precise loophole that had condemned more than half the Titanic's passengers and crew to the freezing North Atlantic. A loophole that had existed not because anyone was careless, but because the existing rules had simply never been forced to confront their own failure at scale. Now they had been. The new convention also mandated regular lifeboat drills, both before and during voyages. It required a 24-hour wireless radio watch on passenger ships, sealing a second fatal gap in the system. The wireless operator aboard the Californian, a ship close enough that it might have reached the Titanic's passengers in time, had signed off for the night just minutes before the distress calls began transmitting. That detail, that single quiet act of a man going to sleep, haunted the aftermath of the disaster and drove one of the treaty's most consequential requirements. And then there was the International Ice Patrol. Created specifically in response to this one disaster, it has been tracking iceberg hazards across North Atlantic shipping lanes ever since. A multinational monitoring operation still running today, more than 100 years later. Few institutions created in the shadow of a single catastrophe have proven so durable. Putting all of this into practice was not cheap. Retrofitting the global shipping fleet with adequate lifeboat capacity and radio equipment represented a significant one-time capital cost, distributed across international shipping in the years immediately following 1914. It was money spent not because the industry had chosen to spend it, but because the existing rules had failed too catastrophically and too publicly for the world to look away. JP Morgan's fingerprints are all over this story, yet that particular thread rarely makes it into the conversation when people start throwing around insurance figures and regulatory failures. The American financier had spent the early 1900s stitching together International Mercantile Marine, an ambitious shipping trust designed to choke off competition and seize control of transatlantic passenger trade. To pull that off, IMM had borrowed heavily, and by 1912, that debt sat like a stone around the neck of every company it had swallowed, White Star Line included. White Star's problem was Cunard, specifically Cunard's Lusitania and Mauretania, ships that could simply outrun anything White Star put in the water. Rather than chase a speed race it couldn't win, White Star pivoted. If you can't be the fastest, be the biggest and the most lavish. That calculation produced the Olympic class. 3 vessels, Titanic, Olympic, and Britannic, conceived as floating palaces rather than ocean sprinters, the most enormous and extravagant ships anyone had ever built. The business model underpinning the whole venture was straightforward enough. First and second class cabins would be sold at premium fares to wealthy travelers drawn in by the opulence. Down in steerage, third class passengers, emigrants riding the continuing wave of European departures bound for America, would pack the lower decks in volume, generating a reliable secondary income stream that, taken in aggregate, was anything but trivial. None of it saved IMM. The trust was already groaning under its original debt load when Titanic went down on her maiden voyage, taking with her the company's most celebrated ship and a considerable portion of its credibility. Within a decade of the sinking, IMM was in receivership. Analysts will tell you the collapse had more to do with how recklessly over-leveraged the trust had been from the very beginning than with any single disaster. And they are largely right. But losing your newest, most heavily publicized vessel before she completed her first crossing did not exactly steady a balance sheet that was already hemorrhaging. More than 7 decades after it slipped beneath the waves, the wreck spawned an entirely separate saga of financial and legal wrangling. The Titanic's resting place remained a mystery until September 1, 1985, when a joint French-American team led by oceanographer Robert Ballard tracked it down lying approximately 12,500 feet beneath the North Atlantic surface, broken into 2 main sections sitting roughly 2,000 feet apart on the ocean floor. Getting there was no small feat. The search relied on deep-sea sonar and remotely operated vehicles, represented a significant research investment, and had failed repeatedly over the preceding decades before finally delivering results. The moment the wreck was found, it became a battleground. Legal disputes erupted over salvage rights, over who held the authority to pull artifacts from a site widely regarded as the final resting place of more than 1,500 souls, and over what responsibilities, if any, a company with salvage rights actually owed toward preserving the site rather than mining it for profit. Congress eventually stepped in, passing the RMS Titanic Maritime Memorial Act and formally recognizing the wreck as an international maritime memorial, while the courts have continued untangling questions of salvage rights and artifact ownership in American federal proceedings for decades since the discovery. There is one final financial comparison worth raising, partly because it has taken on the quality of a running joke among serious students of this disaster, and partly because nothing else quite captures the sheer scale of Titanic's cultural afterlife as cleanly. In 1997, James Cameron released a film simply called Titanic, and its production budget swelled to roughly $200 million, the most expensive movie ever made at that point in time. Adjusted to make the comparison fair, the actual ship had cost somewhere in the range of $120 to $150 million in 1997 money. In other words, the movie about the ship cost more to produce than the ship itself cost to build. Sit with that for a moment. It is a genuinely strange fact, and it says everything about how completely this single maritime catastrophe has been swallowed whole by global commercial culture over the century since it happened, generating vastly more revenue through cinema, museum exhibitions, and licensed merchandise than the original vessel ever produced selling tickets. The Titanic's financial and legal legacy refused to stay buried in the previous century. In June 2023, a submersible named Titan, operated by a company called OceanGate, imploded on a descent to visit the wreck site, killing every one of the 5 people on board, each of whom had paid roughly $250,000 for the privilege. When the vessel went silent, a multinational search and rescue effort mobilized resources from several governments across multiple days before debris was finally located, and the disaster has since spawned wrongful death litigation seeking tens of millions in damages, alongside fresh regulatory scrutiny aimed at an entirely new industry, deep-sea tourism, one that had no meaningful commercial existence until people became willing to hand over $250,000 simply to stare at the ruins of a ship that went down because no one believed it required sufficient lifeboats. Set the whole story end to end, and the picture comes into focus. A vessel that cost the equivalent of roughly $200 million to construct, insured for barely 2/3 of that figure, went to the bottom because a tonnage-based regulatory loophole rendered its lifeboat shortfall entirely lawful, and in doing so, took more than 1,500 lives in fewer than 3 hours on a still, clear night in the North Atlantic. The insurance industry absorbed the claim inside a month. The shipping world rewrote its safety rulebook from the ground up within 2 years. The wreck lay undiscovered for 73 years, then became the subject of sustained legal battle for decades following its rediscovery, and more than a century after the sinking, people are still paying to lay eyes on it, sometimes, as 2023 demonstrated, at a cost considerably steeper than a first-class ticket ever was. The Titanic did not sink because something in the ship's engineering gave way. It sank, in large measure, because a rule that measured the wrong variable, tonnage rather than human lives, permitted a fully compliant vessel to carry half the life-saving equipment it genuinely required, and more than a century of maritime law, insurance convention, and deep-sea salvage litigation runs in a direct line back to that single gap between what the regulation chose to measure and what it should have been measuring from the very beginning.